I'm sure most people had irrational fears as children: clowns, ghosts, power outages, quicksand, things that in retrospect pose little threat, and M-dashes here and there. When you're new to the world, however, your understanding of it is virtually non-existent, and in the absence of comprehension, even the most trivial things can be deeply frightening, no matter the significance. Over time, we outgrow these childhood fears and shift our focus to concerns that are more rational and relevant to our present circumstances. There's nothing more horrifying to the adult mind than unpaid bills and vacant refrigerators. Yet in rare instances, an irrational fear can cling to you for decades, following you into adulthood and suffocating the deepest crevices of the mind. Even when you know better, even when you have more pressing concerns, it remains there, motionless but awake. It can be something as minuscule as a creepy image found on a now abandoned forum, an off-putting sports mascot, a song, a letter, anything. Ridiculous to most, but to you, it's a real unbridled fear. I am one of the few who carry a lingering terror from childhood. It was something that elicited such a visceral reaction upon first encounter that it has shaped the person I am today, immediately throwing my instincts into overdrive whenever I recall the memory. For months, I wasn't able to pull myself out of bed, obsessing over every finite detail, and I have to think pink. Nightmares were aplenty. My favorite food would go into the trash with nothing but a few tiny bites being taken. My notebooks were filled with the confusing, frantic ramblings of a petrified child attempting to uncover a missing integer that in all likelihood never existed and never will. My 10-year-old brain practically shut down for the better part of a year before I began to regain some sense of normalcy. The nightmares and intrusive thoughts gradually subsided, and my trepidation diminished to a more manageable level. Yet even so, there was always a nagging, persistent dread that I might somehow in some way encounter this fear again when I least expected it, perhaps while mindlessly scrolling through the internet in search of something trivial, only for it to appear unexpectedly and against my will. Ironically, although I haven't seen the original source of this panic since that initial encounter, a prominent reminder of it unfailingly resurfaces every single year, forced to relieve my terror all over again. I am terrified of Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer. This is no exaggeration. I am utterly petrified by a small, seemingly harmless servine who showed for Santa Claus around each year. Even the slightest glimpse of this otherwise beloved character makes me nauseous. Whether it's in the form of decorations, stickers, or plush toys, it makes no difference. As if this couldn't be any more specific, the Rankin-Bass stop-motion movie is the single greatest source of my personal anxiety. Each time I encounter even the smallest reference to that film, I am overwhelmed by a sudden acute pain in my head and an instinctive urge to flee. I don't even remember the film. The visuals, the story, and the details no longer hold any relevance to me. I made the deliberate decision to lock every element of it away in my mind, with no intention of ever seeking closure, no consideration that I might one day as an adult desire clarity or resolution. It seems the rest of the world has forgotten about it too, as I cannot find it anywhere, no matter how hard I try. My personal boogeyman has effectively been erased from existence, leaving me with a nagging desire to confront it once more, to give myself the chance to stare the monster under my bed directly in the eyes and determine whether I am truly ready to leave it behind. There comes a point where running can only take us so far, and hiding ourselves away becomes isolating. Christmas is just around the corner, and once again, I find myself confronted by my own personal horror. For an entire month, I am unable to escape it, enduring until the holiday spirit inevitably fades into the mundane fatigue of everyday life. But I am tired of running, of hiding, of being afraid. So I turn to you now, hoping that someone, somewhere, who holds the key to my trauma, will find this post and can provide me with the closure I've so desperately needed for years. When I was 10 years old, I stumbled upon a parody video of the Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer movie that terrified me so much, I spent the next 16 years living in constant dread of accidentally encountering it again. It was 2008. YouTube was rapidly taking the internet by storm, gaining unstoppable momentum. The viral videos of the time were inescapable, spreading across various other platforms like MySpace and early online forums. For many, these videos served as their introduction to the burgeoning video sharing website, but for me, it was through my classmates. I vividly remember them excitedly chattering about something called Charlie the Unicorn, claiming it was the funniest thing they had ever seen. As an uninformed child who spent more time glued to the television than to the family's newly acquired computer, I naturally asked which channel I could watch it on. I was surprised to learn that it wasn't on telly, it was on the internet. When I got home that day, I booted up the computer and used YouTube for the first time. I was instantly hooked. Countless videos, created by people from all walks of life, were just a single click away. Of course, the quality of these videos varied greatly, and it was alarmingly easy to stumble upon content that was arguably inappropriate for children. Yet amidst all its weirdness, YouTube was an addictive platform, filled with some of the most fascinating things I had ever encountered at the time, like watching funny pivot stick figure skits, happy tree friends, etc. It was far more entertaining than television or my extensive collection of DVDs because it allowed me to watch whatever I wanted, whenever I wanted. Nothing made me laugh quite like YouTube poops. These overly edited nonsensical videos, crudely mashed together and reversed in a cheap but effective attempt to elicit laughter, were my favorite. I would sit in front of the computer for hours, watching these absurd renditions of cartoons. It didn't matter whether the cartoon was old or new, popular or obscure, YouTube poopers would inevitably get their hands on it and distort it in countless silly ways. Safe to say, I was an avid consumer. Fast forward to December of that year. Like most kids, I was bursting with excitement for Christmas. The moment my parents put up the colorful decorations, my holiday jitters kicked into high gear, and all I could think about was the big day, December 25th. In my cheerful mood, I decided to search for YouTube poops featuring Christmas-themed media to amplify my excitement. I was aiming for the classics, Elf, How the Grinch Stole Christmas, The Polar Express, the usual trio of films that seemed to play on repeat throughout the entire month. It didn't take long before I stumbled upon mocks of some of the more well-known Rankin Bass films. None of them were particularly remarkable, just the usual remixed nonsense I had seen many times before. However, I distinctly remember that I was watching a Frosty the Snowman parody when I happened to notice the thumbnail to the infamous Rudolph video. The thumbnail was a black and white still of Rudolph as a calf, lying alone in the den where he had been raised. His head was angled upward, as if he were staring at something just out of frame. The video was titled, "Tonight It's Just You," all caps with underscores. I'm not sure whether it was the eerie thumbnail or the oddly formatted title that caught my attention first, but either way I was deeply intrigued. Ignoring the fact that I was only about a quarter of the way through the Frosty the Snowman parody, I eagerly clicked on Rudolph's face to see what the video could possibly contain. The video began with the distorted sound of a howling blizzard, faintly buzzing through my computer's primitive speakers. The screen flickered with grainy low-quality footage of indistinct abstract shapes that resembled the patterns of cheap kaleidoscope toys, though entirely devoid of color. These images cycled rapidly, one after another, before eventually settling on the focal point of the video, Rudolph. Much like in the thumbnail, he was alone in the den, aimlessly turning his head at various angles, as if searching for something unseen. His attention eventually fixed on the entrance to the den. The video then abruptly cut to footage of a real snowstorm. I can't recall the exact details, but the scene appeared to be filmed in a remote mountainous area devoid of any signs of life. There were no structures, no animals, just a relentless flurry of violent snowfall in an isolated, desolate location. The camera slowly zoomed into the storm before suddenly cutting back to the tiny figure of Rudolph. For a long moment, there was an eerie stillness, broken only when he finally stood up and slowly stepped out of the safety of his home. The next shot depicted the calf trudging through the snowy terrain, his head fixed forward and seemingly indifferent to his surroundings. I distinctly remember how this sequence emphasized Rudolph's smallness. The camera remained at a considerable distance, partially obscured by the foliage of the many play trees, as if it were hiding and observing him from afar. This particular scene repeated itself several times over, speeding up and slowing down in irregular intervals before it cut to the next segment. Jagged icy paper glaciers were scattered across the surrounding area, and tiny Rudolph stood in a clearing at their center. He leapt onto one of the ice caps and peered over the edge, his hoofs dangling, as he leaned forward to look at something below. The shock lingered on his expressionless face. He might have blinked once or twice during that moment, but I honestly can't recall if he did, or if he remained completely motionless the entire time. The turbulent sound of the snowstorm was intercepted by a deep bassy droning noise that reverberated ominously. The audio quality was abysmal, crackling through my speakers as it rumbled with an unrelenting intensity. After what felt like an eternity of build-up, the video finally revealed what had captured Rudolph's intense focus. Below him stood another deer-like entity, but it was grotesquely disfigured. Its neck was unnaturally elongated, with an awkward bend in the middle that caused it to lean stiffly to the left. Atop its extended scruff sat the shrunken head of a male reindeer, grossly disproportionate to the rest of its body. Its face was featureless, completely consumed by a patch of black fur that even obscured its eyes. The legs were similarly deformed, stretched and twisted into unnervingly thin misshapen limbs, far too fragile to realistically support the weight of its body. The torso, oddly enough, was the only part of the creature that appeared normal. It was clear that the figure had been crudely constructed out of clay, marred by noticeable bumps and imperfections characteristic of amateur craftsmanship. In hindsight, I assume the creator was attempting to mimic the style of the puppets used in the original film, but if that was the intention, they failed spectacularly. The thing must have been frozen on the screen for no less than a minute, before a black screen with white text hijacked the video. Do you miss the sound of your mother's voice? Your father's? You cannot sit and stare at me forever. Let go of the idea that things could have been different. It has to be this way. It must. You deserved a better goodbye. The video briefly flickered back to the creature after each sentence, implying that it had been speaking to Rudolph. By this point, Rudolph wore a forlorn expression, the first and only emotion he displayed throughout the entire thing. Suddenly, the muffled droning noise ceased, and the sound of the gusting blizzard returned. Rudolph turned away from the glacier and gazed out into the vast snowy expanse. The real-life footage of the snowstorm reappeared once more, before the video finally faded into darkness. I immediately shut off my computer and retreated to my bedroom for the rest of the day. I couldn't stop thinking about it. I began replaying the video over and over again in my mind, desperately trying to analyze and make sense of every detail my young brain could conjure up. For months, I couldn't even muster the courage to use the computer, and turning on the TV felt like a gamble, as there was always the risk of encountering the original Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer film. Thankfully, my DVDs and Nintendo DS kept me occupied until the end of January, when the holiday programming finally disappeared from the airwaves. Thus began my decades-long fear of the lovable reindeer. Nowadays, with a better understanding of the world, I realize that most of my fear stemmed from how the video made me feel when I first watched it. My panic wasn't necessarily due to the content of the video itself, but rather the emotional reaction it evoked. I was afraid of being afraid, but how could I have known that at the time? I'm also wise enough now to recognize that it was the monstrous reindeer creature that disturbed me the most. Of course, the entire thing unsettled me, but it was that one frame of the awkwardly assembled figurine and the words it spoke that caused my heart to race whenever I thought of it. Even now, the picture I have of it in my mind is enough to send me into a cold sweat. A strange, perhaps overly ambitious part of me wants to rewatch it, to give it a final farewell so that I can eventually stomach the thought of a simple children's character. I'm not sure if I'm truly ready to see it again, or if I ever will be. Yet I find myself wanting to preserve it as a part of internet history. I may be the only person it terrified to this extent, making it significant primarily to me, but it remains a piece of YouTube history. That in itself is reason enough to preserve its existence. It comes from an era when anyone could create and upload whatever they wanted, without being stifled by a massive corporation attempting to gatekeep their intellectual property, period. So I ask you now, after everything has been laid out, do you have this video?